Most people think motion and rest are two different physical conditions. Something is either moving or it is not. The idea feels obvious. A book on the table is at rest. A car on the road is in motion. From this habit of speaking, we quietly conclude that nature itself must recognize this difference. We imagine a clean dividing line. On one side is rest, on the other side is motion. And if that is true, then it seems reasonable to ask what lies between them, as if there were a narrow zone where something is neither fully moving nor fully at rest. But this picture does not come from observation. It comes from grammar. Our language forces us to choose verbs. Is moving, is not moving. Once we accept that structure, the world is pushed into boxes that feel physical but are not. The mistake is not small. It is the kind that survives because it feels too simple to question. Let us slow down and look at what we actually do when we say something is at rest. We point to an object and we compare it to something else. The book is not changing its position relative to the table. The table is not changing its position relative to the floor. The floor is not changing its position relative to the building. Already, without noticing, we have built a chain of comparisons. Remove the comparisons, and the statement, "the book is at rest," loses its meaning. The same is true for motion. When we say the car is moving, we mean it is changing position relative to the road. Relative to the air, it may be slower. Relative to the sun, it is doing something entirely different. None of these descriptions is more correct than the others. They are simply different statements about different relationships. The misconception appears when we forget this and treat rest as a special physical state, as if nature itself tags some objects as truly still. Once we do that, motion becomes something added on top, and we begin searching for the moment when motion starts or ends. But this search assumes there is something real to find there. Before asking what lies between motion and rest, we must first face a harder possibility, that the question itself may be built on an assumption that does not exist in the behavior of the world. When we try to strip away assumptions, the only thing we ever observe is change. We see positions at one time and positions at another time, and we compare them. Motion is not something we see directly. What we see are marks on a ruler, ticks on a clock, and records that can be checked again. If nothing changes between one comparison and the next, we say there was no motion. If something changes, we say there was motion. That is the entire operational content of the idea. Notice what is missing. We never detect a substance called motion. We never catch rest as a thing either. There is no meter that reads amount of rest. There are only agreed procedures. Look here, look later, compare. When those procedures give the same result, we use one word. When they give different results, we use another. This matters because it removes the temptation to imagine a hidden switch. As an object slows down, the changes between comparisons get smaller. That is all. Nothing new appears. Nothing disappears. The descriptions change smoothly because the observations change smoothly. The world does not announce a special moment when motion stops. If you doubt this, ask how you would test for such a moment. What instrument would click when motion became rest? Any device you invent will still rely on comparisons over time. And that method never produces a sharp boundary. So motion, as we use the word, is a summary of observed differences, not a physical ingredient added to objects. Rest is the same kind of summary for observed sameness. Once you see this, the urge to search for something between them weakens because you realize there was never a gap to fill. If this helps, comment what changed and subscribe for more clarity. When people first hear that motion depends on comparison, they often nod and move on too quickly. They accept the sentence, but keep the old picture in their head. So it is worth slowing down again and forcing the idea to do real work. Take any object you like and say it is at rest. Now ask a very strict question. At rest, with respect to what exactly? Not in general, not the world, something specific. You will always name another object, the ground, the room, the earth. Each answer quietly shifts the meaning of the claim. Change the reference and the statement changes with it, even though the object itself does nothing. This is not a technical trick. It is not advanced theory. It is forced on us by observation. There is no experiment you can perform that tells you an object's motion without also involving something else to compare it to. You cannot point to a single object in an empty universe and meaningfully say whether it is moving or not. There is nothing for the statement to connect to. Once this is taken seriously, rest loses its status as a physical condition. It becomes a choice of description. We decide to treat one object as the reference and describe others relative to it. This is not wrong. It works extremely well, but it is a decision, not a discovery. The confusion enters when we forget that we made this choice. Then rest feels absolute, and motion feels like a deviation from it. But when you change the reference, the roles swap without friction. What was moving can be described as still. What was still can be described as moving. Nothing observable breaks when this happens. At that point, the original question starts to collapse. If motion and rest are not absolute states, but relational descriptions, then asking what lies between them is like asking what lies between two ways of speaking. The world itself is not divided in the way the words suggest. If this line of thinking made something click, write it in the comments. And if you want to keep following these ideas as they tighten and simplify, subscribe. As an object slows down, people often expect something interesting to happen near zero speed. They imagine a threshold, a last trace of motion that disappears, leaving rest behind. This expectation feels reasonable only because we are used to thinking in categories: moving, not moving, on, off. But again, that habit comes from how we speak, not from what we measure. What actually happens when something slows down is dull in the best possible way. The changes in position between one observation and the next become smaller. That is all. If you measure again sooner, you still see a change. If you wait longer, you may see a larger one. There is no experiment you can perform that suddenly reports motion has ended. Every measurement still depends on how carefully you look and how long you wait. Suppose you try to be clever and say, fine, motion ends when the change becomes exactly zero. Even this does not save the idea. Exactly zero over what time? 1 second, 1 hour, 1 year. A rock on the ground appears motionless over a second. Over a day, it moves with the earth. Over a year, it traces a large path around the sun. The result depends entirely on the time scale you choose, which is another decision made by the observer. This shows something important. The idea of slowing to rest sneaks in an assumption that nature respects our cutoffs, but nature does not know how patient we are. It does not care how long we wait between measurements. It simply continues doing whatever it is doing while we summarize the outcome with words. At no point does the behavior of the object itself change in kind. There is no detectable middle state where motion is half present or undecided. The same rules describe fast changes, slow changes, and no detectable changes at all. The equations we use do not break or switch form at zero speed. They glide through it without comment. That smoothness is not mathematical decoration. It reflects the fact that nothing discontinuous happens in the observations. If there was something physically special about rest, we would expect some trace of it, a signal, a force, a measurable effect. But no matter how carefully we look, we find none. All we ever find are relationships that can be described consistently from many points of view. This is where understanding replaces naming. Saying motion goes to zero sounds like an explanation, but it is only a compressed description of many comparisons giving the same result. The phrase hides the procedure that makes it meaningful. When you unfold the procedure, the mystery drains away. So when you ask what lies between motion and rest, the honest answer begins to emerge. Nothing happens there because there is no there for anything to happen in. The world does not pause, hesitate, or change its rules. Only our descriptions tighten as the observed differences shrink. What remains is not a special state, but a reminder that nature is continuous, and our categories are not. Once you accept that nothing special happens, as motion becomes very small, you are forced into a quieter but deeper question. What do we really mean when we say something is at rest? Not in words, but in practice. What do we actually do differently when we decide to use that label? In practice, rest means we stop correcting for change. We pick a reference object and agree not to track its motion any further. We build our measurements on top of that decision. A table is treated as still, so we measure everything relative to it. The earth is treated as still, so we draw maps and build houses without accounting for its motion through space. This choice is not hidden. It is openly built into every measuring device and every coordinate system we use. The important point is that nothing in nature enforces this choice. The table does not emit a signal saying, "I am truly at rest." The earth does not announce itself as a privileged object. We choose them because doing so simplifies our descriptions and keeps errors manageable for the questions we care about. That is all. This is why rest works so well without being fundamental. When relative changes are small compared to the accuracy we need, treating something as stationary produces reliable predictions. Bridges do not collapse because we ignored the Earth's motion around the sun. Projectiles land where we calculate they will. The success of the approximation tempts us to treat it as a truth about the world instead of a decision about description. But the moment we push precision or scale, the approximation shows its seams. Long-range artillery must account for the Earth's rotation. Satellite navigation must account for the motion of both satellites and receivers. Astronomical observations must abandon Earth-based rest entirely. The same object moves in one description and rests in another, without contradiction, because nothing physical has changed. Only the bookkeeping has. This is the sense in which rest is operational, not absolute. It is defined by what we ignore, not by what exists. And because it is defined this way, it cannot mark a physical boundary. There is no experiment that detects rest itself. There are only experiments that detect changes relative to a chosen standard. Once this is clear, the original question finishes dissolving. Motion and rest are not two regions separated by a border. They are two ends of a continuous description that depends on choices we make for convenience. Asking what lies between them assumes they are locations in nature, when they are really labels we attach after the measurements are already done. This does not make physics vague. It makes it stricter. It forces every statement to be traceable back to an operation, what was compared, over what time, with what reference. Any claim that cannot be unpacked this way is not wrong, it is meaningless. Understanding this removes a common anxiety. People worry that if rest is not absolute, then nothing is solid. In fact, the opposite is true. The rules become tighter because they no longer rely on hidden assumptions. What survives is what can be checked from any consistent point of view. At that stage, motion and rest stop feeling like deep opposites. They become tools of description, useful when used carefully, misleading when treated as things. The mystery does not deepen, it shrinks. At this point, it is worth separating two very different kinds of questions, because they often get mixed together without anyone noticing. One kind of question asks for something the world can, in principle, answer. The other kind asks for something that sounds meaningful but does not connect to any possible observation. Physics is not bothered by unanswered questions. It is blocked only by meaningless ones. Consider what physics can actually do here. It can tell you how positions change relative to chosen references. It can tell you how those changes depend on forces, constraints, and initial conditions. It can tell you how to predict future comparisons from past ones and how accurate those predictions will be. All of this works smoothly whether changes are large, small, or too small to detect. Nothing breaks as speeds pass through zero. The same rules continue to apply. What physics cannot do is reveal a hidden label attached to objects that says truly moving or truly at rest. There is no experiment that could find such a label. because any experiment must compare something to something else. If you imagine removing all references, you have also removed the possibility of measurement. At that point, words lose their grip. This is where confusion often sneaks back in. People hear that motion is relative and conclude that everything becomes vague or subjective. But relativity here does not mean opinion. It means relationship. The relationships are precise, measurable, and repeatable. What is not absolute is the choice of which relationship to highlight. Once you see this, the original question changes character. What is between motion and rest now sounds less like a deep mystery and more like a grammatical trap. It treats two descriptions as if they were physical locations with something in between them. But descriptions do not have interiors. They summarize outcomes. There are still real open questions in physics, but this is not one of them. We do not lack a theory that explains the middle. We lack a reason to believe there is a middle to explain. That is an important distinction. Some questions are unanswered because we have not looked hard enough. Others are unanswered because they stop making sense when you look carefully at what they are asking for. This does not mean the thinking process was wasted. Quite the opposite. By following the question until it collapses, you learn something durable about how understanding works. You learn to distrust explanations that rely on names instead of procedures. You learn to ask each time what was actually observed, how it was compared, and what was chosen for convenience. In that sense, the resolution is not a final statement, but a discipline. Motion and rest become tools you can use without being fooled by them. You can say an object is at rest and know exactly what you are ignoring. You can say it is moving and know exactly relative to what. And when someone asks what lies between, you can recognize that nothing has been left out. If this way of thinking clarified something you had carried without examining, write it in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring questions like this slowly and without shortcuts, subscribe. There is one last source of confusion that needs to be handled carefully because it hides behind a feeling of depth. People sometimes say, even if motion and rest are relative, surely there must be some deeper sense in which the universe itself knows what is moving. They imagine a silent background, an ultimate frame, something against which all motion could finally be measured. This idea feels serious because it promises closure. But again, we must ask what it would mean in practice. Suppose such a universal standard existed. How would we detect it? Not in words, but in actions. What measurement would behave differently when an object was at rest relative to this background, compared to when it was not? Any proposed test must involve comparing readings taken at different times or places. But the moment you describe the test, you have already introduced references, instruments, clocks, distances. The background itself never enters directly, it is only named. This is not a philosophical objection, it is an operational one. Physics only advances when a proposed distinction leads to a difference in observable outcomes. If two descriptions lead to the same predictions for every possible measurement, then treating them as physically different adds nothing. It is not that one is wrong and the other is right. It is that the distinction does no work. Historically, people searched hard for such an absolute reference. They were not careless. They built careful experiments and expected to find effects that would reveal true motion. But every time, the results refused to cooperate. The behavior of objects depended only on their relationships to one another, not on any hidden backdrop. The idea of absolute rest slowly lost its grip, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. This teaches an important lesson about understanding. Sometimes we cling to a concept not because it explains observations, but because it satisfies a psychological need for finality. We want the world to pick a preferred description, so we do not have to. But nature does not do us that favor. It remains consistent under many descriptions, and that consistency is the real fact to be explained. At this point, The original question has been stripped of every support it had. Motion and rest are not physical substances. They are not states objects pass through. They are summaries of observed change or lack of detected change made relative to chosen references and timescales. As those choices vary, the labels vary. Nothing else does. What remains is not a gap in knowledge, but a sharpening of standards. When you ask a question about the world, you must be able to say what observation would count as an answer and what would count as a different answer. If you cannot do that, the question may still sound impressive, but it floats free of the world it claims to describe. Seen this way, what's between motion and rest turns out to be a useful trap. It catches sloppy thinking by tempting you to imagine a boundary where none is required. Escaping the trap does not give you a new object to think about. It removes an unnecessary object from your thinking. That is a quieter kind of progress, but a more reliable one. You are left with something modest and strong. Objects change their relationships over time. We describe those changes in ways that are convenient for the task at hand. When the changes are small enough to ignore, we say rest. When they are not, we say motion. And when someone asks what lies between, the honest answer is not complicated. There is only the same continuous behavior, described with different levels of attention. So the answer, in the end, is almost disappointingly simple. There is nothing hiding between motion and rest because nothing ever switches from one physical mode to another. There is only change observed over time compared to something chosen as a reference. When the change is too small to matter, we stop talking about it. That decision belongs to us, not to nature. The world continues smoothly either way. If this way of thinking replaced a familiar but fragile idea, say so in the comments. And if you want more careful thinking like this, without shortcuts or slogans, subscribe.